The hair on the back of the cook's neck stood up. It felt like he was being watched. He turned around. Nothing. It was Nellis Air Force Base in the middle of the night. The mess hall was empty. All the men were asleep in the barracks. The only people awake were him and a couple of guards at the front gate. The only reason he was up was to grab a little extra chow. One of the perks of being a cook. You get the keys to the kitchen. Then he heard rustling. He turned, and something flashed in the corner of his eye. Something small and white, and it moved fast. A door quietly squealed open. Then he heard steps running into the desert. He caught glimpses of something white darting through the brush. He thought it was too big to be a rat, but maybe a coyote. He wasn't sure. Whatever it was, he didn't want it rooting around his kitchen. He picked up a rock and threw it toward the noise. Then he heard a whimper. As he reached his arm back for another throw, he felt a hot pain shoot through his body. He dropped the rock. He was paralyzed by pain and by fear. Then he heard a woman's voice from inside his own mind. She said, "Stop or die." The pain dissipated as soon as he could move. He bolted back inside the kitchen, locking the door behind him, terrified. He had no idea where the voice came from, but he knew one thing for sure. It wasn't human. Did you meet the extraterrestrials, or merely see them? Oh, I met them many times, as I described in my books. Although I never went looking for them, they were always happy to come looking for me. It was March 1965 when Charles Hall arrived at Nellis Air Force Base in the Nevada desert. He was fresh out of basic and excited to see his new post. When the Air Force tested Charles, he showed an aptitude for math and science. After graduating top of his class, he thought he could choose his own post, but he was specifically sent to Nellis Area 51. Well, Area 51 is officially a detachment of Edwards Air Force Base, but yes, it's in the same area. Charles was trained as a weather observer. His job was to travel around the base, taking
back
readings.
and forth until I
Most
found it,
men would
and
be
then
bored
that's what
to
it
tears
showed
with
me,
this
and I
assignment,
showed my son,
but
he's like, got
Charles
these tears
didn't
coming to his
mind.
eyes. No
He'd get his own
way.
truck, extra pay, no officers breathing down his neck, and he liked the quiet of the desert. If he needed to blow off some steam, Las Vegas was close by. Plus, Charles had a friend on base. His buddy, Dwight, recommended him for the job. Charles was grateful for the opportunity. That night, after he settled in, Charles and Dwight got to talking. They chatted about the base, how bad the food was, which officers were good guys, which ones to avoid, typical soldier talk. Then suddenly, Dwight got very serious. "Look, Charlie, summer's coming. You have to keep your eye out for Range 4 Harry. Old Harry likes it hot. He hides in the mountains during the winter, but once it warms up, he comes down to Indian Springs. He likes to run around on the dry lake bed up on Range 4. When you're up there, be careful." Range 4 Harry? Charles had no idea what Dwight was talking about. He asked if this was some hermit who hid in the mountains. Yeah, who would be crazy enough to run around nuclear bombing range? Well, that's what Charles thought. Dwight frowned and shook his head. Then he told Charlie the story of Range 4 Harry. Back in '54, there was an atomic bomb test over at Frenchman Flats. Harry is a horse who came too close to the blast. Not close enough to be vaporized, but close enough that something happened to him. Now he gives off a white glow. If you see him, do not approach Range 4 Harry and don't look at his face. He's not like a normal horse. Officers say he's more human-like, with large blue eyes and a long white tail. Charles stared at Dwight for a long moment, then exploded into laughter. He expected some kind of hazing at his new post, and he figured Range 4 Harry was supposed to spook the new guy, but he wasn't falling for it. "I'm serious, Charlie. While you're at Range 4, don't take any risks. The last guy who got too close to Harry was John Zimmerman. I don't want you to end up like him." Charles laughed and promised to be careful. Still, he wasn't buying any of this nonsense. The next day, Charles was in the infirmary's waiting room. He needed a routine physical before going out into the field. The nurse on duty caught him chuckling to himself. She asked what was so funny. Charles recounted Dwight's Range 4 Harry story and the fate of John Zimmerman. The nurse's face dropped. She said, "I'll be right back." Charles heard her opening and closing a metal cabinet. When she returned, she said, "I'm not supposed to show you this, but since you're going to Range 4, you need to know what's out there." It was Zimmerman's medical folder. Inside were 4 pictures, each of them showing a man covered in horrible radiation burns. Zimmerman said a white horse came out of the North Range and charged him, but that was all he could remember. He somehow dragged himself back to Indian Springs, where an officer found him, barely alive and in absolute agony. Charles's stomach sank. It wasn't a joke. Range 4 Harry was real. Charles finally met Sullivan, the man he'd be replacing. Sully was friendly, funny, and likable. The two men hit it off right away. Sully took Charles on a tour of a few weather shacks out in the ranges. One of the shacks was locked, so they couldn't access the equipment to take their readings. Sully told Charles to just write down any numbers. Government precision, well, Charles reminded Sully that they only checked out 3 weather shacks. There were still 4 more, range 1, 2, 3, and 4. Sully's demeanor changed immediately. He said he'd take Charles to the other weather stations, all except range 4. When they got to range 1, Sully wouldn't leave the truck. He was terrified. He told Charles if he wanted to check out the weather shack, he'd have to go on his own. Sully said he'd keep a lookout, and if he saw anything, he'd go back to base for help. He told Charles, "If you hear me leave, lock yourself in the shack and wait. I'll come back for you." Yeah, I don't like this plan. Well, Charles asked if Sully was talking about range 4 Harry, and Sullivan snapped at him and said, "There's no such thing." But Sully would not get out of the Jeep. He wouldn't even take his hands off the wheel. He was squeezing the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles were white. This was not the same man Charles met just a few hours earlier. When Charles got to the weather shack, he checked the equipment and logbook. Nobody had been there for months. Sully had been secretly going off base and faking the numbers. He never stepped foot in those weather shacks. Oh, nobody noticed. The guy kept disappearing. All right, government precision. When Charles returned to the Jeep, he confirmed that Sully had been lying about the numbers. Sullivan didn't care. He said he'd give Charles a tour and never wanted to go to the ranges again. Pretty soon, Charles would understand why. Over the next few months, Charles spent more time on the ranges at Indian Springs than anyone else. Against advice, he was usually out there alone, but he enjoyed it. It was peaceful, and he never saw range 4 Harry. One day, Charles was out on the range, and it was especially hot. In the desert, the ground could reach 120 or 130 degrees, and today it felt even hotter than that. Charles spent most of the day in the weather shack. He didn't have air conditioning, but he had an old fan, and that was good enough. Besides, the sun was setting, and soon it would go from blistering hot to freezing cold. That was life in the desert. Feet up on the desk, Charles daydreamed as he gazed into the desert, watching the sky go from deep blue to orange to red. There was no sound except the songs of meteors. Charles wondered to himself if meteors were common in the desert. He didn't think so, but whatever birds they were, he enjoyed the sound. Then he saw something dart between the sagebrush. Charles blinked. There it was again. He assumed it was a large rabbit or coyote, but it was covered in brilliant white fur. The more he focused, the more he realized it was moving erratically through the maze of sagebrush like it was in distress. Charles jumped out of his chair and threw open the door of the shack. Then he saw it. It wasn't a rabbit or a coyote. It was a child. I described them. I know we have an animated picture of what they look like on the website. Kind of describe the tall whites for us. Well, the one that Paula has on her website is a very good rendition of a particular tall white lady. Each one of them is individuals, like the people say in New York City. But they were generally throughout much of their adult life. They were about the same height as me, 5 feet 11 inches, 6 feet. They were very thin and frail. They had skin as white as a piece of paper. What I do know about them is that they come from a planet that's somewhat hotter than the Earth and somewhat larger than the Earth. And they spin and they naturally live underground. The girl was barely 3 foot tall, and her skin was chalk white. She wore a silver jumpsuit and boots, and her hair was brilliant white blonde. Behind her bright blue eyes, she looked as terrified as Charles. She was tangled in the brush. He called out to her. He said there's no reason to be afraid. He wasn't going to hurt her. He cleared the sagebrush around her so she could easily get out, but he made himself clear that he wouldn't touch her. On in the night, and the desert was pitch black. The songbirds and the screeching had finally stopped. The only sound was a gentle rustling of wind through the brush. Charles gathered his nerves and left the shack. He checked his canteen. It was half empty. He scrambled to his Jeep, fired up the engine, and tore down the dirt road, heading back to base. No more than a few minutes passed when Charles thinks this. These have been made by the Lock Skunk Works. Skunk Works is Lockheed Martin's advanced development program. It works on highly classified research as well as exotic can make somewhat decent vehicles. Through conversations during his 2-year post at Nellis, Charles learned the Tall Whites oversaw the development efforts. While Tall Whites may appear somewhat human, their abilities are quite different from ours. They possess the power to project powerful emotions into the human consciousness. They can also sense the emotional state of the humans they encounter. Even though the Tall Whites are naturally peaceful, they are always armed. They carry a pin-like object that can stun, damage, or even kill. EW. It sounds like a sonic screwdriver. Kind of, yeah, but Charles was never in danger. He developed a deeply emotional relationship with the Tall Whites. Not much is known about Tall White biology. We know they age slowly. Their first stage, they can grow up to 8 or 9 foot tall, and their eyes turn from blue to pink. The average lifespan of a Tall White is about 800 years. Charles mentioned the star Arcturus. They became uncomfortable. Arcturus is in the constellation of Boötes. Whatever. The Black Knight satellite is supposed to be from Boötes, but you're right. That star system has come up before. Now, despite being a more advanced species, Tall Whites secretly fear humans' intuitive capabilities and ESP. They believe it's just a matter of time before the human race evolves the ability to tap into these powers. They believe we'll develop abilities like telepathy and telekinesis, which is moving objects with thought. They believe every human has the ability to project their consciousness to any place on Earth or beyond. Remote viewing, right? Remote viewing. Researchers have said that every human has this ability, but only a few talented people have been able to tap into it. Ingo Swann, Pat Price, and Joe McMoneagle were talented remote viewers who worked for military intelligence, and Pat Price was killed because of it. Don't forget that's the theory. Remote viewing, links below. Yeah, we have a lot of episodes on that subject. Well, in total, Charles's experience with the Tall Whites lasted just 2 years from 1965 to 1967. In '67, he was deployed to Vietnam, and he never saw the Tall Whites again. He waited almost 40 years to tell his story, but when he finally did, other witnesses came forward who had seen the Tall Whites. There was enough first-hand accounts that researchers started looking for evidence. The first step was to try to find the secret facilities built by the United States government, and some found them. When Charles Hall wanted to release his book Millennial Hospitality in 2002, no publisher would take it on. And that was a mistake. He self-published, and the book was a hit. 2 more books followed, and Charles made the typical rounds: UFO conventions, book signings. He did a few TV interviews. He even appeared on Coast to Coast with George Norrie in 2005. When you work with aliens, I think you're legally required to go on Coast to Coast. Well, if you want to sell books, that's the show to do. Now, all this attention brought out skeptics who wanted to prove Charles wrong, and it that looked into Charles's story, the more of the story was confirmed to be true. Charles was at Nellis Air Force Base when he said he was. He was a weather observer. He was deployed to Vietnam in '67. All those facts are easily checked. I want to hear about aliens. I'm getting to them. Get there faster. Some of the best research I found was done by David Hilton.